All right, so hopefully everybody can see this. So just a little about me real quick. As Aaron said, I'm a data platform MVP, although I probably do as much in PowerShell as I do with SQL Server Business Intelligence. I'm the owner of Cain Training and Consulting. Most of my training I distribute through Pluralsight. I'll go ahead and mention up front that the stuff we're going to go over today, some of it is contained in a course I did for them called Beginning PowerShell Scripting for Developers. So I've got a link on my blog post. You know, the question everybody always asks is, can I get the code samples? So absolutely. As a matter of fact, they're already on my blog. The only thing you really have to remember is arcanecode.com. And if I run this, we'll go ahead and open this up, and you'll actually see my blog post for today at arcanecode.com. I've got the information on the presentation. Down here are the code samples. So you can see those are already there. And then here is a link to my Pluralsight courses. This will take you to the page. You'll see I've got quite a few out there for PowerShell, including the Beginning PowerShell Scripting. I've also got one on PowerShell and SQL Server. It's a little old, but everything there still applies. If you don't have a Pluralsight subscription, the folks there were kind enough to provide me with a whole list of codes that I can then give you for a free 1-month trial with which you can watch my videos or any of them. And there's a link here. You can just email me free@arcanetc, and I'll be glad to send you a code. This is both for people if you're watching this live or if you're watching this later as a recorded video on YouTube. You're more than welcome to email me. All right, so that's pretty much the extent of what will pass for slides for my presentation. I'll mention if you're going to be in Atlanta for the 21st SQL Saturday there, I am giving a presentation on the tabular data model. So look forward to that. Come up and say hi. All right, let's go look at high-class PowerShell. This course is going to cover how to create your own objects in PowerShell and how to work with them. Now, let me scroll up here real quick to talk a little terminology. If you're coming from a .NET background, most of the words we're going to use are going to be pretty comfortable. However, if you're more of an admin type, some of this may be kind of new to you. So we're going to use the old analogy of a blueprint for a house because it's something that everybody can relate to. So a class is equivalent to a blueprint. It has all of the instructions for creating a house, but it's not actually a house itself. Now, a class, or once it's created, the object will have properties. These are things like, you know, do you want brick or vinyl siding? Do you want 4 windows or 5 windows? You know, how many windows do you want? How many doors? That kind of thing. We then have what are called methods, or you may also call them functions. And these are actions that a class can take, such as install driveway, build house, that kind of thing. Now, when the blueprint is actually used to start creating a house, that is the equivalent of a class being turned into an object. And that process is called instantiation. So when we are instantiating a new object, essentially we're taking that class and turning it into an object. Each object is an instance of the class, just like each house is a copy of the blueprint. So hopefully that little terminology here will make things a little simpler for you as we go through this. So down here, we're going to actually create our first object. Here I've got a variable called properties, and with that variable, I'm going to use a hash table. So @squiggly says this is a hash table, and I've got 3 properties in my hash table: schema, table, and comment. And this could actually be hard-coded words. This could come from a variable. And let's actually just make this schema, and we'll just make this table. Let's go ahead and make these comment. There we go. And I'm placing the ordered tag in front. It was a new introduction in PowerShell 3 that basically tells the hash table, keep the properties in order. So here are my properties, schema, table, and comment. And I now just have a hash table. To actually create an object from that hash table, we're going to use a commandlet called new object. And what new object's going to do is just what it says. It's going to take whatever you pass in and turn it into an actual object. Now, PowerShell has a built-in object type of PS object. So for the type name, we'll just say PS object. And then the properties for this object are going to be passed in through the property parameter, and it's just going to be our hash table. So we'll run that. And now I can actually go through. If I just want to display what's in the schema, you can see at the bottom it has schema, table, and comment. However, if I want to reassign these, I can simply reassign each one through just setting the equal sign. There's my schema, my table. If I actually want to see everything, I can just run the $object variable, and it actually breaks me down and shows me all the properties in my object, schema, table, and comment. Now, typically, when you're creating a new object, it is very helpful to surround that process in a function. So for most of these, the demos we're going to see here, I've actually got functions created. So here I have a function called create object. And you can see I'm passing in three things, schema, table, and comment. This would be equivalent to the schema and table in a database, and then a little comment that talks about it. And this is essentially the same code, except I'm actually using the variables I passed in as the original properties. I create my object exactly the same way I did before, and then the function actually returns that object. So I'm going to highlight this and run it just to put this function into memory. And then we're going to use the create object function. We're going to pass in the three variables, and then I'm going to display the results of that. And there you see I've got my new object with schema, table, and my comment. Now, I do want to mention this. When you're working with objects and you're wanting to reference properties of the object, you can't just say my object.schema within your string, because the string interpolator, you can see, will see, oh, I've got a variable called my object, and you can see what it did was it broke down the object into the three parts of the hash table, and then it just printed out .schema after it. Well, that's not what we wanted. Instead, what we have to use is the $ left paren and then a closing paren. And what this tells PowerShell is, hey, whatever comes in here, I want you to evaluate that and then stick the results of that evaluation into my string. So here is where I can actually now use my object.schema, and now it will actually print out the property correctly. And of course, we can change these properties here just like we did before. You can see they've been replaced with new schema and new comment. Okay. Now there's an alternate way that we can create our objects. Here I've got another function. And in this example, I'm actually going to start with an empty object. So I've taken object, I've set it equal to new object, I've told it it's a type of PS object, but I'm not putting anything in it. So I've just got an empty blueprint. You know, I've got that big blue piece of paper with nothing on it. So now I want to start adding the members of my object one at a time. And there's a couple ways I can do this. I can use add member. I can pass the input object. Note here at the end, I don't know how well y'all can see this, but that's not a bug on your screen. That's the little backtick symbol, which is the line continuation character in PowerShell. So I've got one of those at the end. We'll use those quite a bit here. After I pass in the input object, I'm passing in what's called a member type. The member type tells the new object, hey, here is the type of thing I'm putting in here. A standard variable is going to be a note property. And just because it says note, don't think it has to be a string. It could be an int or pretty much anything, but it's just a variable of some type. I'm going to name it schema, and then I'm going to go ahead and put a value in there of $schema. Now, there's an alternate syntax which you can use where you take the object, you pipe it to add member, and then you add the rest of the properties. Now, this can be useful if you are working with a stream of objects and you want to add this member to each item in the stream. We'll look at that later on. And then I do the same thing for my comments. So what we're going to wind up in this function is the same type of object we had before, just created in a slightly different way. So here we go. We're going to call the function and my schema, my table. So pretty straightforward. No differences in the way we display it or address it. Now, if I run myObject.getType, it's going to tell me this is that PS custom object. So I know this was created as a custom PowerShell object. Now, each property has its own .NET data type. So here I'm going to run getType on my comment property, and it tells me it is a string. If I had placed an integer in here, it could tell me an int, double, and so forth. Now, if I actually want to see the member types, remember I said this was a note property, I actually want to take this and pipe it to get member. And you can see down here at the bottom, I have comment, schema, and table all as note properties. So I'm just showing you this to distinguish the .NET data type from the member type. So two different types here. The .NET data type is just what it says, int, string, whatever. The member type is going to be something like note property, or we're going to add a few more next. So next up, a lot of times you're in a situation where you have a property, but different groups want to call it different things. A great example is in the Windows file system. A long time ago, the what are now called folders were actually called directories. So C:\Windows is a directory on your computer, but as time went by, Microsoft kind of renamed the nomenclature to call them folders. So us old geezers, we still call it directories, but you young whippersnappers like to call them folders. We'd like to be able to call them the same thing, you know, have them address the same thing no matter what we call them. So we're going to do that here with the member we added. If you remember, we have a comment property. What I'd like to do is add the ability to also call this description. So I'm going to use add member, and there's my input object, my object. And that's the one we just used in the previous example. And then for the member type, I'm going to add alias property. I'm going to pass in the name of description. This is what the new name is going to be. The value is what the original property name was. There's also this little pass-through flag. What pass-through does is it just passes the member on out the stream, and I'm just doing this so you can see it displayed here. So when I run this, you'll see it outputs my schema, my table, and you see I have two columns, comment and description, and they both have the same text. If I actually come here and run these, you see they both say comment and description. Now, if I change the description, you're going to see it also changes the comment. So with this, I can call the same property by multiple names. This isn't something I use a lot, but it can be really helpful, especially in your corporate environment where you've got different groups who all have different terminology for the same thing. So aliases can come in quite handy there. All right, but we're not done. We can actually add scripts to our objects. Here I have a script block that I've defined. As you know, we can actually put a script block inside a variable. We just say variable name equals, and then we have our opening and closing squiggly braces. And what I have in here is a line that returns the fully qualified name of a table, FQN, and it is this.schema plus period plus this.table. So it's going to return me dbo.employee, for example. Now, this keyword is used whenever you're working with objects. If you recall, for example, where object, inside of a where object, you're used to using the $ underbar. Same thing, just represents the current instance of our object. And so let's highlight this and run it. And now we're going to use add member again to our input object. This time for the member type, we're going to call it a script method. So all we're doing is telling PowerShell, hey, this is actually a script that I'm adding to the object. I want to call it fully qualified name. And the script value I have defined in the variable $ block. And we'll use pass-through to run this. Now, it doesn't show you the script methods when it's displaying the various things that are in an object, but we can use the get member on our object, and you can see now down here at the bottom we've got fully qualified name, and that it is a script method. Now, when we call our functions, they need to end in a parenthesis. If I actually run this and I don't include the parenthesis, all it does is, if I scroll up here, you'll see it displays the script, any overloads, member type, and just information about it. If I actually want to call the function itself, I need to come up here and I need to include the parentheses. Now it actually returns our myschema.mytable. So pretty cool. We can now add scripts to our objects. But wait, Robert, what if I want my script to have a parameter? Well, that gets pretty easy. All we have to do is add a little command here called param. And this will tell it this is the type of parameter I want. And then once there, you can see I'm now using it inside my new function. So database.schema.table. And so we'll run this. And then the add member is exactly the same as before, where it's a script method. We just have a different name, database qualified name. Now, any parameters we want to add, we simply place inside the parenthesis, such as my DB name, and there we go. We get my DB name.myschema.mytable. So now we can not only add scripts to objects that we've created, we can actually add scripts with parameters. Pretty cool. Now, there is another type of script we can add, and that is a script property. Now, a script property, if you're familiar with the background of C#, there's something called getter and setter functions. Essentially, it is a way that if you have a property, but you'd like to add some extra logic whenever somebody accesses that property, you would use a script property. It combines both scripts and properties into one type of object. So, clear the screen, and I'm going to add another member, just a standard note property called author name. And we're going to give it a value of no author name. And if I run this, you can just see I now have my author name here of no author name. All right, so next I need to define a couple of script blocks. For the first script block, it's going to be my get block. This is the block that's going to be called whenever somebody wants to get this new property we're about to add. I'm going to return this new author name property. We're going to reference it with this. We're just going to return it. And then I've got a set block. In the set block, I'm using a param, which we've just seen. This does require you to pass in a parameter of a single value. So I can only have author, or whatever, I can name it whatever I want to. But now I can actually, in my script set block, I can actually say, well, if the author length is 0, then I want you to execute this code where I actually give you a default author name. And then finally, I'm going to set the author name property to the value that I've now got. So we'll run this. Okay. So now I've got my get and my set. I'm going to add this member type script property. The name is going to be author. The first value you pass in is the get portion. The second one is the set portion. So now I'm going to set the myObject.author, and you can see it now equals our Cain code. If I set it equal to nothing, to an empty string, you'll now see that our setter kicked in and it replaced it with our Robert Cain MVP. Now, there is a little quirk to this, that the original property, remember we had added a property called author name, which is what author is referencing. It's still visible. So if I come here and I run this, you're going to see that when I try to display it out, I get nothing. So by going to the original property, it bypasses the getter and setter. Now, if I still want to go through the getter and setter, now it's made available. Okay, so let's come down here and let's see how we doing on time. Pretty good. So you've noticed that whenever I run the my object, I'm starting to get a lot of properties printed out. I get schema, table, comment, description, author name, and author. That may be more than I want if I just want to reference the most commonly used set of properties. So I got to give out a shout out to the Poshaholic blog for kind of pointing me in the right direction on this. And I've got a link in here that you can actually go read his blog post on this. But essentially, this gets us into real geek land, because we're going to be accessing some of the underlying code for PowerShell. So the first thing we need to do is set the default properties we want. So whenever somebody wants to just type in my object, I want to display these 4 properties and only these 4 properties: schema, table, comment, and author. So we'll put those into a standard array. And now I'm going to create something called a property set. A property set is something I'll pass to another function in the PowerShell library. I'm sure you've heard the phrase PowerShell is built on top of .NET. Well, not only is that true, the specific piece of .NET it's built on is the system.management.automation libraries. One of the things in there is PS property set. PowerShell lets you have different types of property sets, and what we want is the default display property set. So we pass that as the first parameter. It's just a hard-coded string that says this is the type of property set we want. And then the second is we pass in an array of strings of our default properties, which we just defined up there. Now, you may wonder why we have to strongly type this. Well, oftentimes when you're working with .NET libraries, they sometimes, not always, but sometimes they have a little trouble understanding the PowerShell kind of variable types that we have. So it's often best to just hard code, strongly type the data type. So here we'll just use this, and it's going to create a new variable of our default property set. Now with that, I can then create something called a PS member info object. An object in PowerShell has multiple information objects associated with it. We're going to create a new one, a new member info that's going to be the property set. So we're saying, hey, here's some information. This is the property set I want to call. So we're going to call that. And then we just simply use add member, and we're telling it, I want to add a member set of standard members, and here they are, $ members, to my object. And now when I run this, you're now see that I only get the 4 items I wanted and not the 6 that we had before. So pretty simple. Even, take some time to look up the MSDN documentation if you really want to understand more. But if not, at least you can follow this template to use to get the change your default property set. We can also use the format list to see that now I have the standard 4. Now, you might go, gee, Robert, well, what if I want to see all of them? Well, we can simply use the format list command up here, and we can pass in -property asterisk, which says, hey, go ahead and display all of them. So now you can see when I run this, I get all 6 of my properties again. Okay, so another cool example now. We're going to create an object in an entirely different way. A lot of people coming to PowerShell may have some familiarity and some comfort with the .NET world. Here I'm going to use some C# code to create a class from C#, an object using a C# defined class. This also works with VB.NET, so all us VB lovers, this will work for us too. Here I've got just a code block that I'm defining inside a big here string using system. I'm naming it my object static, and I'm actually putting in a static method. Now, a static method is a method in which I can call it without actually having to create an object from it. So, for example, if we go back to the blueprint, there may be an instruction on the blueprint that says, call the Housing Commission to set up inspections. Well, that's obviously something you can do without actually having to build a house or even break ground. You can just do that right off the instructions on the blueprint. That's what a static method is like. It's something that you can use no matter, without actually having to create the object. So, and it just says set a return value, combine the schema and table name that get passed in, and then return it. So very, very simple and straightforward. So we're just going to put all of this into the variable. And then we're going to add a new type definition. So type definition of $code just says, hey, here's a new object type that PowerShell can now reference. And we have to tell it the language is C#. And so I just set two variables to DBO and our Cain code. And now here is my class, my object static, and I've got those in brackets so it's typed, to call a static method on an object. And this is going to apply whether it's an object you create yourself, one out of the .NET library. We simply use two colons, colon, and then we call the name of the function we're calling, and then any parameters. So if I run this, you're going to see that it properly returns DBO our Cain code. Well, that's cool. Static objects, that can be handy. What if I don't want static? What if I've got a class I want to use that has some non-static things? Well, no problem. Here I have another class in which I have a public string called SomeStringName. Now, I did it like this to keep it simple. If you're a C# guy, you could have used the getters and setters and so forth. I just did this to keep it simple. And then I have the public string composed full name, which is pretty much the same code, except you'll note it's lacking that static keyword that you saw a second ago. So let's run this, put it into memory. And all that does is put the string here. We're going to add the type definition like we did just a second ago. And so this type, public class my object embedded, is now going to be a variable type that we can create. So here we'll say new object, and you'll see we say type name. And earlier we used the PS object. Here we're using our named my object embedded. So when I run this, you can see I have $result, SomeStringName equals, and we'll set its value and display it. I can actually call it. Boom, there I'm calling it. If I use the IntelliSense, you can see I actually have the SomeStringName and the composed full name are properly loaded into IntelliSense. So pretty cool. All right, one more. Let's say you have your code inside of a C# file. For a short class that, it's okay to embed that code right in your PowerShell script. But if you've got an especially large class, you may actually want to store it in its own .cs file, but maybe you've created this inside Visual Studio. And so you've got this cool C# class, you've played with it, tested it. Now you just want to reuse it here in PowerShell. So I'm going to set a variable equal to the path and the name. I've got a class called high-class PowerShell.cs. And if there's a cool shortcut we can use to actually open files in PowerShell, psedit. So if I run psedit, it'll actually open up a file, and here you can see same my object external, but other than that, it's the same code we've been looking at. Close that. Let's come back over here. And so we're going to use the get content to load the content of our file. we'll pipe it through ouch string and put it into the code variable, and now the code is identical. So here we're going to call the static method, and we get our DBO arcane code. So again, a great way if you've got a class that you want to reuse in your PowerShell code, not a problem. Now, this last demo for this series, but not the last one of the day to be sure, is really cool. Let's say you have a existing set of objects. For example, getChildItem returns a system.io.fileinfo type of object. What I would like to do is add my own script method and a note property to this file info object. Well, using the techniques we've seen here, we can actually do that. So for my script method, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a script method that actually tells me what type of file this is. So here you can see I've got my script, and I'm doing a switch, and the file info object has a property called extension. So with that extension, I can simply say, well, if it's a PS1 file, tell me it's a script, PSM1's a module declaration, C# file. For the default, I can just say, dude, I got no clue, seriously stumped. And then we return that. So now I'm going to load the variable with a collection of file objects. So I'm going to set my location to this little folder where my demos are, and then I'm going to use getChildItem to load up that collection of file info objects. Now within my for each loop, I'm going to set a little item count variable just to act as a counter, and that's what's going to go in my note property. So here you can see I say item count plus plus is the first thing that happens. And then for each file info object in my collection, so for each item and items, I'm going to add a member of note property. It's going to be an item number, and its value is going to be whatever the item count is. So the first one's going to be 1, second one 2. This is just simple to show you how this works. And then I'm going to use add member to add my script method. I'm telling it the name is script type and the value is my script. And then finally, for each one, I display the results to the screen. I display my new item number script property. I use the name property built into the file info function. And then I'm calling the script type function or script type method, depending which way you want to call it, same thing, to display what type of item it is. And down here at the bottom, you can see, well, I've got number 9 was my class module.ps1 as a script. The XML file, oh, no clue, didn't know what an XML file was. I've got a module declaration, some more scripts, and so forth. So pretty cool. This is very, very powerful because it allows you to extend existing objects even if you don't have the underlying source code or didn't write that object. So very, very powerful. And if I go here and I pipe this through the file info for the first items get member, you can see I have a new script type script method is now added to that file info object. If I scroll up here, we'll see that our new, here's the script property. So lots and lots of good information. There's our item number note property. So super useful information coming from get member. All right, let's say you've got a really, really cool object that you're using in your script, and what you want to do is save the state of that object so that the next time your PowerShell script runs, you can just reconstitute that variable from what you saved. Well, PowerShell thought of that. Turns out to be very easy. Here you can see I've got a little hash table called my site properties. We're going to stick it in an object using the new object syntax we've already seen, and we'll show it. So now what I want to do is save this out to a file. So I've created a variable to hold the path to my file, and then I'm going to take that variable and I'm going to pipe it through the export CLI XML commandlet, and I pass in the path to the file. So let's go take a look at that. We're going to use psedit again, and what you're going to see is pretty much gibberish. It's an XML file, obviously, but what's going to go in here is probably not going to make sense to you, but that's okay. PowerShell understands it. So to reconstitute this information back into our object, we simply use the reverse commandlet, import CLI XML. Now I've got a variable here called new my site, and right now there's nothing in it. If I run import CLI XML, and then I run new my site again, now it's reconstituted what was in that object, puts it into this object variable. So even though it's not the same name, it still understands what's there. So useful way to save the state of objects and then recreate them at a later time. Okay, so everything I've showed you so far is going to work great in PowerShell versions 3 through 5. Some of it should even work in 2. There's a few little things I used here and there that were new introductions to 3, but you could probably reverse them if you're still on 2. If you are still on 2, you have my deepest condolences. New to PowerShell 5, however, are 2 new structures, enums and classes. So for your PowerShell 5 folks, let's go look at some stuff here. I have an enum. Now, what in the world is an enum? Well, an enum is just a list of hard-coded values that somebody could pick from. You can then validate that within your code. So here I've got an enum called My Twitters, and these are my the 3 Twitter accounts I use. The first one is my company, Cain TC, Cain Training Consulting. The second one is my geek one that I just use for sharing and interacting with the SQL family. I'm also a ham radio operator, so I've got one to follow a lot of the ham stuff and for IXT. So all you just say is enum, you get the enum name, and then you put each one in here. And so now to address an enum, you simply use the name of the enum, My Twitters, ::, and then arcane code. So here, when I assign that value to the tweet, you can see it returns arcane code. Now, what's nice about this is it also gives you IntelliSense. So if I put in my Twitters, : when I hit that second colon, it gives me the list of valid values. So really, that is the big selling point for enums, is I don't have to remember what these various values are. They will pop up in IntelliSense. From here, I can actually do things like check to see if the values are valid. There is built into the enum an isDefined method in which I pass in the enum, My Twitters, and then I pass in the value. And what isDefined says is, well, whatever they entered, is that a valid value from my enum? You can see down at the bottom it says true. Now I'm going to set that tweet to something invalid, and then you can see it comes back false. So again, enums, just a cool way to be able to provide a list of predefined hard-coded values to make it easy for people developing using your enums, or for you when you get into a function, for example, you can then check to see if what they passed in is a valid enum. All right, so the next new thing is a class. Yes, in PowerShell 5, you can actually define your own classes now. Here I have a class which I've called Class Twitterer. The first type of thing you can place in a class is a property. All properties have to be strongly typed. So here I've got a property. It is a string, and it is called Twitter handle. For a property, I can also set a default value by simply having =, and then whatever I want my default value to be. Properties could be of any type, so these could be ints, doubles, whatever. I can also define functions within a class. Instead of using the keyword function, you use the return type that the function is going to return. So here, I'm using the word string. I'm giving it the name of the function, Twitter URL. Note, there is no $sign on the front of this. And I have parentheses. Got to have the parentheses even if you have no parameters. And then I have my simple script block that says, well, I'm going to combine a URL that's going to return the Twitter handle of the current object. So $sign this we use here just like we did with the objects in the previous section to access the current instantiated object based on this class and say, hey, I want this one's Twitter handle, stick it in the string, and then return it. I have another function here. This function doesn't return a value. Well, if we don't want to return a value, we simply use the word void to tell PowerShell, hey, this goes off and does something, but don't expect any results back. And this just simply says start process and returns the Twitter URL. So let's run this just to create this class and put it in memory. Okay. So to create a new variable based on this class, you use the class name, Twitter, : and then you use a keyword called new. And this calls the new method off your Twitterer class. Note, we didn't explicitly define this new method. It's just built into PowerShell. When you create class, PowerShell goes, oh, you've got a class, I'm going to automatically add a method called new. And this just says go create a new version of this class, and it's going to put it into twit, which is going to be an object. If I run this, you're going to see under get type, Twitterer. There it is right there. So the object type is Twitterer. So now if I come here, I'm going to set, if I just look at the Twitter handle, by default it's blank because we didn't set a default. But once I assign it, you'll see it has arcane code. Now, we haven't assigned a name yet, but when I run this, it already has a value coming back. That's because we used a default property for it. I can simply override the default value by removing the C. If I run the Twitter URL function, you see I do so by using the object name, just like we did before, period, Twitter URL, and there is the parenthesis that says this is a function, and this simply returns the twitter.com/arcane code. If I call the open Twitterer function, it's going to open up my Internet Explorer, or actually this is the new Edge because I'm on Windows 10, and here is my page, arcane code. So we'll just minimize that. That is a basic class. It's just that easy to get started with classes, to create something reusable. Let's look now at a class that is a little more robust, has a little more advanced concepts in it. So here is what I call the advanced class, Twitterer Redux. Now, what I thought would be nice to have is when I call that new function to create a new class, it would be nice to be able to go ahead and pass in the Twitter handle or the Twitter handle in the name when I create the new class. Well, we can do so by using something called a constructor. A constructor is called when you generate that class. And we'll see exactly how that works in a second. But what you would do to call a constructor is you use the name of the class without a data type associated with it. You then pass in any parameters that you want. So here I've got a string called Twitter handle. And you can see the code in here sets the this.Twitter handle. Likewise, I've got a second constructor where I can pass in two parameters. So I've got Twitter handle and Twitter name. Now, earlier, when I called the new function, but under the hood, this is actually what's getting called, is this new empty constructor. The problem is once I start creating other constructors, PowerShell removes the default one. So you have to add it back. So to do so, you just create a class with no parameters and no code. If you still want a default constructor, you may not want to allow the user to create a new object from your class without going through one of these predefined constructors down here. And that's perfectly okay if that's what you want to do. In my case, I wanted to allow the user to create a kind of default empty object. So I've put back the default constructor. I've got a property just like I did before with the Twitter handle and the name. I wanted to show you though, earlier when we were looking at our classes coming from C#, we had that keyword static that let you create a property or a function that would persist even if the class hadn't been instantiated. You could just call it off the class. So to do so here at PowerShell, you simply use the keyword static, and then you put in the data type and then the value that you want. So here I've put a version number here as a static property, and then I've created a function that returns a string. You've already seen this one. But now I want to create a second function that has the exact same name but has a parameter. In the previous example, if you don't pass in a parameter, it just uses the this.Twitter handle. That is the just like we saw in the previous class. But now I also want to create a function that allows the user to pass in the Twitter handle, and if they do, it will instead use the parameter and not the one built into the class. Well, if you want to have two different functions that do similar things but have different what they call signatures, you use what are called overloading. And overloading simply means I have one version that has no parameters, a second version that might have one. I could have a third version that has two parameters and so forth. So you can have as many functions as you want to, all have the same name, as long as they have a different number of parameters. And that's how PowerShell or any .NET library matches which version of the function to call is by the number of parameters. I then have that function that you saw already, open Twitter, but I've got another version of this that is a static function. So just like I can have a static property, I can have a static function. Here I am passing in a string of Twitter handle, and there is the URL that I'm going to open. So let's run all of this, and I think some of this, if you're a little confused, that's okay. It'll make much more sense once I actually put this class into play. So, too far. Oh, there we go. Okay, here's the example. So we're going to call this using the default constructor. So you can see I've just called the new. And so now we can see that default value in their Twitter handle, nothing there. Now I'm going to assign it. You can see I've now got it set to Arcane TC. So far, this is working just like the previous class we've got. So here is the URL. And now I'm going to call the same kind of Twitter URL you saw before, where it relies on the internal this.Twitter handle property. But now I'm going to show the overloaded version. In the overloaded version, it's going to use Arcane code. It's not going to use the Arcane TC, which I stored in Twitter handle. And sure enough, there it is. So now let's create a new instance of the class. Now we're going to use that second constructor that I can use to go ahead and populate the Twitter handle when I create it. So if I run this, you can see I'm calling new, but instead I'm passing in this n4ixt. So I'm going to hurry through this last part. We've got just a few minutes left. When I run this, now a minute ago, when I created a new version of the class, Twitter handle was empty, but now it has something in it because I took advantage of that constructor. So here is the third version where I'm populating both of these. Here you can see I can call on my Twitter Redux, I can call that static property by simply using class name, colon, and the static property name. There's the version number. Same thing here. if I call the open Twitter page static method by using class name : open Twitter page and passing in Arcane TC, now it's going to open up my Arcane Training and Consulting Twitter. All right. Now, we're out of time, but I want to mention real quickly, it is possible to put classes inside modules and use them. I have on my blog in the previous 2 days, if you scroll down here, and I've got the links right here, but it's just the previous couple of days blog posts, I go into great detail on how to actually do this. See, here's the one for using the classes. So I go really deep into that. So good instructions there. Again, all you really have to remember is arcanecode.com. I've got the presentation. I've got links to those 2 blog posts I just mentioned, which tells you how to access a PowerShell class defined inside a module. So you can read through that. Again, what you've seen here today is it's kind of a slice of my beginning PowerShell scripting for developers course available on Pluralsight. There is the link to it. And again, if you don't already have a Pluralsight subscription, just send me an email, free@arcanetc.com, and I'll be glad. Pluralsight has graciously given me a whole bunch of codes that I can pass out. They're 1-month trial codes, which you can watch mine or really anybody's courses on Pluralsight. So again, no obligation there. So arcanecode.com, there's a question, is this being recorded? Yes, it is. As soon as the recording is available, I will put a link to it on my blog. So just come back to the blog, probably in I don't know how long it usually takes to get out there, usually a day or so. And we'll go from there. I know we're out of time, but we can look through the questions. I think all the questions are saved to a file that Chrissy or Aaron could email to me, and I'll look through them, maybe create some blog posts out of them. Was there anything, guys, that you saw that might want to rump out?
Just a question about the Azure catalog right there.
Looking at it, in theory, it probably could. I don't know enough about the Azure catalog as of yet, but that sounds like a really good series of blog posts that I'll look into and see if I can post a good answer about that.
All right, great.
So for all of you who are going to email me, be aware I've got to run out of here to another meeting right now. But
yep.
Late this afternoon, just be patient with me. Late this afternoon, I'll start passing out all the links. And if you're watching this recorded, still feel free to email me, even if it's months down the road. I'll be glad to send you that free Pluralsight code.
Thank you so much.